Hi, I'm Pat.
And I'm Jesse. Welcome.
Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so today we're getting into some really critical research. We're looking at how our early life experiences, especially the tough ones, the adverse ones,
Yeah.
how they can actually shape our health, our well-being way down the line.
It's profound, really.
It is, but look, this isn't just about listing the challenges. We want to explore the pathways to resilience.
Yeah?
How can we foster those positive coping strategies?
Exactly. It's about the what now part.
Right. So we've gathered insights from, well, a major long-term study on what they call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
We'll unpack that term for sure.
Definitely. And also a look at different coping mechanisms, how people deal with stress, and even this really fascinating dissertation. It's about Latinx college preparation.
Oh, yeah. That one offers such a unique angle on overcoming, historical adversity. It's powerful stuff.
It really is. So our mission for you today, we want to cut through all the information overload and really highlight the key takeaways, the things that help you understand that deep impact of early life and, crucially, what actually makes a difference in building that resilience.
Let's dive in.
Okay, let's start with the basics. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. What are we actually talking about here?
Right. So these aren't, just everyday bumps in the road.
Yeah.
ACEs refer to really stressful, sometimes traumatic things happening during childhood.
Things like,
Well, the early research really zeroed in on childhood abuse,
mhm.
sexual, physical, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, serious stuff.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting and maybe more relevant for more people. The definition expanded quite a bit.
How so?
It now includes a much wider range of, let's call it family dysfunction. Things like parents dealing with mental health issues, parental divorce, substance misuse in the home,
Uh-huh.
even losing a parent, or growing up in persistent low socioeconomic status. It's a broader picture of early hardship.
That makes sense. It captures more of the chronic stress some kids face.
Exactly. And what's really striking is how rarely these things happen in isolation. A child facing one ACE often faces others too.
Right. They stack up.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
That's why in the research, they often use what's called a summed ACE score. It's basically just a count of the different types of ACE someone experienced.
And that score tells us something.
It tells us a lot. Study after study shows this direct, almost linear relationship. The more ACEs someone has,
The worse the outcomes later on.
generally, yes, across a whole range of health functions,
Yeah.
it's that cumulative burden that seems to be really damaging.
Okay, that's a stark connection. So when we talk about long-term health, what does that actually look like? Are there specific conditions or maybe common biological pathways the research points to? How does this early stuff physically show up years later?
Yeah, great question. If we look at the bigger picture, these ACEs can fundamentally alter someone's life path, affecting both mental and physical health.
How? Like, what's happening under the hood?
Well, they seem to negatively impact the development of our core biological regulatory systems. Think about your body's stress response system. The HPA axis is the technical term.
Right, the fight or flight stuff.
Kinda, yeah, but also the long-term regulation and inflammation pathways too. When these systems get disrupted early in life, it's almost like setting your body's internal thermostat way too high permanently.
So you're more reactive.
Exactly. More reactive physiologically, more reactive emotionally to stressors throughout your whole life. It makes later stress harder to handle.
Wow, okay. Any specific health links?
Oh, definitely. One study found the number of ACE categories was linked to increased risk for serious conditions like heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, even skeletal fractures and liver disease.
That's a wide range.
It is.
Sure.
Another found something like a 20% jump in heart disease risk for each additional ACE someone reported.
20% per ACE, that's huge.
It is. And maybe the most jarring finding came from some research a few years back. It basically suggested that every 3 ACEs someone experiences is comparable biologically to losing about 9 years of life expectancy.
9 years for every 3 ACEs.
Yeah, it really hammers home how this isn't just emotional. Childhood adversity physically accumulates, it gets under the skin, influencing multiple body systems and significantly increasing the risk for all sorts of health problems later. Our past literally shapes our biology.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a heavy foundation, but absolutely essential to understand. And it perfectly sets the stage for the next piece. Coping strategies. If you've gone through this level of early stress, how do you deal with it?
Right.
The research suggests ACEs don't just happen to you, they might also influence how you learn to cope later on. So, what are the main coping styles the sources talk about? Why is this distinction so important?
Good question. So coping generally is seen as our purposeful response when stress hits, right?
Yeah.
How we try to manage it.
Makes sense.
And the research often looks at two main types in relation to ACEs. First, there's problem-focused coping. Let's call it PF coping.
Okay, problem focused. Sounds straightforward.
It mostly is. It's about directly addressing the problem,
Mm-hmm.
trying to solve it, building up that sense of, I can handle this, or self-efficacy, tackling the issue head on.
Like making a plan, seeking information.
Exactly. Then there's the other type, avoidant emotion-focused coping, or AEF.
Avoidant. Okay, sounds less helpful already.
Well, it often is, long-term.
Hmm.
AEF strategies are about trying to reduce the negative feelings caused by the stress, but crucially without actually fixing the underlying problem.
So, like,
Okay, it could be literally avoiding the person or situation, distracting yourself maybe with work or TV or less healthy things.
mm-hmm.
Even in extreme cases, self-harm, which one study specifically linked to this kind of avoidance pattern. The key thing is, research suggests kids in really stressful homes are more likely to lean on these avoidance strategies. It's understandable, really, as a short-term survival tool.
But it becomes a habit, maybe one that doesn't serve you well later.
That's the risk, absolutely.
So, problem-focused versus avoidant emotion-focused. It seems simple on the surface, but what's the deeper nuance here? Especially, for someone listening who might think, well, distracting myself does make me feel better sometimes. Does the research explain why these potentially unhelpful strategies stick around and what the real long-term cost is, particularly for people with ACEs?
Yeah, that's a really important point about effectiveness versus, let's say, long-term impact. The big longitudinal study we looked at, the MIDAS surveys, followed people for 20 years. It absolutely confirmed that ACEs were linked to worse mental and physical health later on. No surprise there, based on what we just discussed.
Right.
But critically, their findings also predicted how coping played a role. They expected and found that this avoidant AEF coping would lead to more psychiatric problems, more physical health issues down the road.
Okay.
And conversely, that problem-focused PF coping would be linked to fewer problems, better outcomes.
Makes sense.
And the data back this up. AEF coping was clearly associated with higher rates of things like major depression, generalized anxiety, panic disorders, and also various chronic physical conditions.
So avoidance is definitely linked to negative outcomes. What about the problem-focused stuff? Did that help protect people?
It was associated with better outcomes, yes. But here's the really interesting nuance. PF coping didn't seem to act as an independent protective factor after they accounted for the impact of AEF coping.
Wait, say that again. So problem-solving skills didn't matter on their own as much.
It suggests that maybe the most critical thing isn't just adding more problem-solving skills, but actively reducing the avoidant coping. Getting rid of the maladaptive stuff seems to be at least as important, maybe even more important, than just trying to add more good coping.
Wow.
In fact, think about effective therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? A huge part of treating anxiety and mood disorders is often about reducing avoidance behaviors, facing the difficult stuff instead of running from it.
That really flips the script. It's not just about doing more good things. It's about stopping the things that feel okay short-term, but hurt long-term.
Precisely. It highlights how those immediate relief strategies can actually keep the problem going.
That insight really hits home. It's almost like our brains are wired for that quick fix, even if the fix is just, I don't know, ignoring a tough email or putting off a conversation. We've all done that, right?
Absolutely.
And this connects perfectly to that idea of toddler brain coping mechanisms that one of the sources talked about. Can you unpack that concept? It sounds relatable.
Yes, it is relatable. And it's actually a brilliant way to frame it. So coping mechanisms, at their core, are adaptations, right? Ways we learn to deal with stress in our environment, aiming for comfort, or maybe a sense of control.
Okay.
And usually they're conscious, at least initially. We know we're doing them, even if they become habits. Now think about toddlers. What do they do when stressed or challenged?
Blame someone else. He did it. Hide. Pretend it didn't happen.
Exactly. Blame. She started it. Denial. I don't know how that broke. Avoidance. Literally hiding under the table. And why do they do that? Primarily to protect their budding sense of self, their autonomy, and crucially, their connection to caregivers. The source points out that the real pain for a toddler isn't just the timeout itself.
It's feeling disconnected, losing approval.
Precisely. It feels like a threat to their very sense of self and belonging.
Yeah.
Now, here's the kicker. The source argues that when we as adults unconsciously fall back on these same basic tactics, well, it doesn't work so well anymore.
How do they show up in adults?
Denial might look like stubbornness, refusing to see a problem. Avoidance could be chronic procrastination, or maybe emotional eating or doom scrolling.
Hmm.
And blame. Well, blame is about projecting those uncomfortable feelings like shame or anxiety onto someone else. It might give you a temporary hit of energy or righteousness.
Yeah, that feeling of I'm right, they're wrong.
Exactly. But the source says it comes at a huge cost.
Mm.
Ultimately, relying on these coddler brain tactics leaves us powerless over our own emotions and situations. It prevents genuine growth and responsibility.
It's that short-term relief versus long-term pain again.
Absolutely, the ultimate example of that trade-off.
And it feels like these short-term, maybe less mature coping styles
Yeah.
are really tied to a fundamental resistance to change, right?
Yeah, that seems to be a core part of it.
The source actually lays out 5 really interesting reasons why we often dig our heels in, why we avoid change, even when we know deep down it might be good for us.
What are they?
Okay, first, just a basic fear of the unknown. Change is uncertain. Second, fear of failure. What if I mess up?
Classic.
Third, simple apathy. Just not caring enough, maybe feeling too overwhelmed to even try.
But what's the point? Feeling.
Exactly.
Ugh.
Fourth, clinging to what's familiar, what feels tried and true, even if it's clearly not working anymore. The comfort of the known rut.
Mm.
And finally, a lack of faith in changemakers that could be distrusting leaders or even just not believing that we ourselves can actually make a difference.
Wow, those 5 together really paint a picture of why breaking those old patterns, those toddler brain reactions, is just so incredibly difficult sometimes.
It really does. It shows the depth of the resistance. So given these huge challenges, the long shadow of ACEs, the stickiness of unhelpful coping habits, this resistance to change, what does real, sturdy resilience actually look like, especially for people facing really deep-seated or even historical adversity?
Yeah, moving from the problem to the potential.
Exactly. And we have this incredibly powerful example from that dissertation we mentioned, the one on Latinx college preparation. It offers such a different, really inspiring perspective on overcoming huge barriers and actually cultivating strength.
No, that study is fantastic. It really serves as a counter story, challenging those narratives that focus only on individual grit or deficits.
How so?
Well, it's what they call an autoethnographic testimonial. Basically, it's the personal and academic story of a non-traditional first-generation Latinx student who's also a mother, detailing this incredible 36-year journey to getting her doctorate.
36 years. That's persistence.
Unbelievable persistence. And her argument is that just focusing on academic prep misses a huge piece of the puzzle. She introduces these holistic guiding values, or HGVs, as being absolutely crucial for sticking with it.
Holistic guiding values. Like what?
Things like family restorative justice, we can dig into that one. Cultural perpetuity, keeping traditions alive.
Mm.
Ethnic identity.
Hmm.
Professional activism, using your position to make change.
Mm.
And life balance.
That sounds much broader than just study hard.
Exactly. And she found that things like oral family history, the wisdom passed down from elders' epistemology is the academic term, become huge assets. For instance, her own grandmother couldn't go past 6th grade. Why? Because she was female and needed for ranch work back then.
Wow.
Understanding that history, that struggle, it doesn't just weigh you down. It creates what the researcher calls historical tenacity.
Historical tenacity. I love that phrase. What does it mean?
It's this recognition that, okay, if trauma can be passed down through generations, then so can strength. So can resilience. It's inherited, it's cultivated. It flips the script from seeing hardship only as a deficit to seeing the strength that grew alongside it.
That concept, historical tenacity, it really resonates. It feels like it broadens our whole understanding of resilience beyond just the individual, right? But what's the takeaway for someone listening now, maybe someone who doesn't feel they have a big historical narrative, or they're wondering about that other term you mentioned, family restorative justice? How does that fit in?
That's a great point. I think historical tenacity, for anyone, is a reminder that resilience often isn't just about you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's often woven into your family story, your cultural background, the collective strengths passed down, even if those stories also contain struggle. We can actively look for and learn from the perseverance of those who came before us. It connects us to something bigger.
Finding strength in shared history, even painful history.
Yes. And as for family restorative justice, in this specific context, it's about using education as a tool for healing and balancing things out. It's a way to maybe counteract feelings of shame or guilt about past circumstances or decisions, either your own or your family's.
Okay, how did that play out for the researcher?
Well, for her, getting her undergraduate degree, which was in family studies, wasn't just for her career. It was about restoring a sense of justice, maybe to her own family, by understanding child development better, overcoming the resource limitations she faced growing up.
Using knowledge to heal the past, in a way?
Exactly. And later, when she pursued an MBA after a divorce, it was a very conscious move to better provide for her kids, to create stability and well-being for them. It's leveraging education not just for personal gain, but for the family's balance and future.
So it reframes education as a community or family act, not just an individual one.
Precisely. It shifts completely away from looking at communities, especially communities of color, through a deficit lens. Instead, it sees them as holding this incredible wealth of cultural knowledge and strength, using education for collective upliftment and healing.
This focus on personal and family resilience, driven by this collective purpose, it's illustrated so well by another part of that dissertation, the San Luis Border Scholars Study. This program took place in San Luis, Arizona, a community that's almost entirely Hispanic, and they found some really amazing ways to help students succeed and get to college. Tell us about that program.
Yeah, the San Luis Border Scholars Program is a fantastic real-world example. They use some really innovative strategies and started early, like fifth grade early.
Fifth grade, wow. What did they do?
Well, instead of just passively identifying gifted kids, they actively developed talent. They tutored students specifically in algebra to prepare them for advanced aptitude tests.
So they gave them the tools first.
Exactly. And once those students were identified through those tests, they got access to advanced classes, early college credits, through dual enrollment, even prestigious summer programs run by places like Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth.
So they opened doors early. Did it work?
The results were pretty remarkable. Get this, 0% of the students in the study ended up going into demanding STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, math. Think civil engineering, aerospace medicine.
80%. That's incredible.
It really is. And it powerfully demonstrates how tackling those early barriers, especially in foundational subjects like math, can literally change the trajectory of a young person's life, opening up options they might never have considered otherwise. It was proactive, targeted intervention.
That is so impactful. But it sounds like it wasn't just about the tough classes and the test prep, right?
Yeah.
How did the actual school environment, the teachers, the counselors, how did they contribute to this success? What can we learn from their approach?
You're absolutely right. It was much more than academics. The human element was crucial. Students in the study consistently talked about specific counselors and teachers who truly believed in them.
Like mentors.
Exactly. People who encouraged them to dream big, who made them feel like they belonged in academic spaces. There were stories about specific teachers, like a Mr. Chavez, a Mr. Arizin.
Real people making a difference.
Absolutely. Mr. Arizin, for instance, he was actually recognized by President Obama as a champion of change. He was teaching college-level algebra to 7th graders.
7th grader.
Yeah. And he acted as the go-between for dual enrollment, helping these 12 and 13-year-olds earn actual college credit, totally free of charge. That's going way above and beyond.
That's incredible dedication. It sounds like creating a whole supportive ecosystem.
It really was. It was about building what the research calls a culturally responsive environment. They used specific approaches rooted in Latino culture, like convivencia.
What's that?
It's about building real human connection, mutual trust between teachers and students. And platicas, these are like informal, intimate conversations for sharing stories, giving advice, building community.
So relationship building was key.
Essential.
Yeah.
And also conocimiento, fostering this kind of critically aware thinking, helping students connect what they were learning to their lives and their community's needs.
Making it relevant.
Deeply relevant. Students talked about seeing their parents' hard work, often in really tough agricultural jobs, and how that fueled their determination. Their desire wasn't just personal success, it was often about giving back to the community that raised them.
Wow. So that personal activism, that drive to contribute, becomes part of their resilience too.
Exactly. It transforms individual struggle into a kind of collective strength and purpose.
So let's bring this all together. What does this deep dive mean for you listening right now? I think it reveals this really powerful truth. Yes, adverse childhood experiences can cast incredibly long shadows, no doubt about it.
They absolutely can.
But the human spirit's capacity for resilience, especially when it's nurtured by effective coping strategies, by supportive, culturally responsive environments, that capacity is just as profound.
It really is. There are pathways forward.
Definitely. Whether that pathway involves consciously developing more problem-focused ways of coping, or maybe understanding and starting to shift away from those ingrained, unhelpful, avoidant behaviors we talked about.
The toddler brain stuff.
Right. Or drawing strength, that deep strength from family history, from community connection. The point is, pathways to well-being, to achievement, they absolutely exist even after significant adversity.
And that really brings up an important question for all of us, doesn't it? How can we in our own lives, in our families, in our workplaces, our communities, how can we foster environments that truly acknowledge the full human experience? Meaning environments that see the challenges, yes, but also actively recognize and leverage those deep well springs of cultural strength, of historical resilience that people carry within them.
Yeah.
That idea of historical tenacity, it isn't just relevant for specific groups. It's really a reminder for every single one of us to look for the resilience that's already woven into our own stories, our own family backgrounds, however complex they might be, and then to consciously tap into those strengths. How can we leverage our own historical tenacity? That's something to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it sparked some new insights for you, maybe encouraged a little reflection on your own story of resilience and how you might apply some of these ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot to mull over here.
Definitely. Please join us again soon for our next deep dive. And hey, if you found value in today's conversation, we'd really appreciate it if you'd share it, maybe leave a comment or a like wherever you're listening. It helps others find the show.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll talk to you next time.